Welcome back to Scripps News Tonight. We begin this half hour with breaking news. A giant of American diplomacy, Henry Kissinger, has died. A German-born immigrant turned former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Kissinger played a central role in American foreign policy. He worked with President Nixon to open U.S. relations with China and relax tensions with the Soviet Union. And he was an architect of policies with major human consequences, including the U.S. bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War, pushing for the U.S.-backed coup that installed dictator Augusto Pinochet, and supporting Argentina as its military junta killed thousands in its so-called dirty war. Our next guest knows the life of Kissinger well. Lindsay M. Chervinsky is a presidential historian and author of The Cabinet. Lindsay, good to have you. Henry Kissinger lived an incredibly long life, 100 years, did so much good and bad. What exactly will be his legacy?
Well, that's a big question. Thank you for having me. I think what Kissinger perhaps represents is the very complex 20th century and the United States' role in the changing world and the changing issues that the nation and the global community grappled with. Everything from World War II to the Cold War to the much more complicated and interconnected conflicts that we saw across the globe in the latter part of the century.
Yeah, understanding the context in which he lived and worked is really important here. I'm curious to know, how do we, or how should we properly reflect on somebody like Kissinger with such a long and complicated legacy? I mean, is it possible to hold both the good and bad at once? Someone who reshaped American diplomacy, set up relations with China a half-century ago that shape our present and future, but also someone who actively made decisions that killed thousands of civilians who many consider a war criminal.
Yeah, I think we have to try and hold both thoughts in our head because, all humans are generally complicated creatures. And I think Kissinger was especially so, but especially at a time when foreign policy was very rarely black and white. The Cold War did require a lot of compromise and really difficult decisions. And that's not to say that he made the right ones or he was correct in his decision making, but we do have to both acknowledge the good things that he did in trying to limit the spread of nuclear proliferation and try and increase communication with China and help secure peace in the Middle East in the 1970s, and also the human rights violations that you mentioned. We really can't speak about him without talking about both sides. And maybe perhaps the best way to say it is that we really can't understand American foreign policy without understanding both sides of Henry Kissinger.
Right. You ask so many people in U.S. politics and foreign policy, and Henry Kissinger's name still resonates today in a way almost nobody from the 1960s and 1970s does. Why exactly is that?
Well, I think it's for a couple of reasons. One, his story is really an American story. His family was refugees that fled the Nazi regime in Germany, and he was able, through really his own extraordinary merit and gifts, to work his way up through the educational system and find a place for himself. And so that is a remarkable story. I think also the extraordinary power he wielded, especially under Nixon. He was the first person to serve as both the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State at the same time. I think he's the only person that has held that position for at least a lengthy tenure. And so those positions are incredibly powerful and incredibly influential for our foreign policy. And so for one person to have so much control, especially when the president was maybe distracted. Nixon was, towards the end of his presidency, very focused on Watergate. And so Kissinger had really free rein to do almost whatever he wanted. And that is a nearly unparalleled situation in American history.
Yeah, basically a Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken combined all at once. You talk about having tremendous influence, and there it is right there. Speaking of his childhood, how exactly did his childhood in Germany, fleeing the Nazi regime and coming to America as an immigrant, really shape his life and work?
Well, I think if you asked him and if you asked the people that he knew, you would get different answers. He said that it didn't really shape much, but I do believe he was quite grateful for the opportunities for his family in the United States. However, those that knew him said that the experience of being bullied, of being ostracized, of really being sidelined because of his Jewish faith, and then his father losing his job and losing their place in the community, that did leave a permanent mark. And he did therefore want to be accepted. He wanted to be powerful. He wanted to have people in positions of authority seek him out. And I think that that is a very understandable human condition and not a surprising one. What I think perhaps is more interesting is later in his life, he was not as perhaps friendly to other refugee communities, especially Jewish refugee communities that were looking to flee the Soviet Union, as you might expect. And he thought that if he was overly preferential to those communities, that it would damage his ability to form arrangements or treaties with the Soviet Union when he was really trying to draw down conflict. And so I think that's one area where perhaps he went extra lengths to try not to lean on that personal history, to try not to lean on that faith, and really instead focus on realpolitik.
Yeah, Lindsay, before we let you go, I want to bring this full circle here. How exactly has Kissinger's work really imprinted on the world we see around us? I mean, how is his work still impacting us today?
Well, Kissinger was perhaps the most well-known advocate for a very realism-based foreign policy. The understanding that there are no easy decisions, that there are going to be consequences often in human life when you are making a big decision on the world stage. And so I think that that understanding that foreign policy is messy and really can't be driven by ideals is one way of looking at diplomacy. And as I think perhaps maybe one of the more influential ones. And Kissinger was really the best messenger and best spokesperson for that view of the world.
Presidential historian Lindsay Chervinsky, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate your time.